As we've discussed many times on this channel, Britain is hurtling towards the 29th of March, the day the UK is set to leave the European Union. Currently, there's no deal in place between the UK and EU which lays out how trade will work between the two. At the time of recording, the UK is still in the EU, and as such, the UK is a member of Europe's single market, customs union, and free trade area. We discuss all three in depth in other videos, but essentially it means that the UK is able to trade freely with other EU nations without these other nations being able to place tariffs on British goods, and these products are able to pass through borders without customs checks. This makes trade very easy between EU nations. The issue that people have with this system is that the UK doesn't have a lot of control over trade. All external trade deals are made by the EU, meaning the UK can't strike deals with other nations. And in addition to this, the UK has very little control over trade within the EU. Without the ability to place quotas or tariffs on EU goods, they are able to flow freely into the UK without the UK having any say in the matter. This is partly why some people chose to vote for the UK to leave the EU back in 2016. The reasons people voted to leave are numerous, but one of the key themes is regaining control over trade. One way the UK could regain control is by leaving the single market, customs union and free trade areas. This hard Brexit would allow the UK to set their own terms for trade and negotiate trade deals. Hard Brexit is also what would happen if no deal is reached, which is looking increasingly likely as time left to negotiate runs out. If the UK hasn't reached a deal with the EU by the 29th of March 2019, the UK will automatically leave all elements of the EU in what's often called a cliff edge Brexit. This would result in a lot of changes, which we discuss in our video on the topic, link in description. But a lot of the most important consequences relate to trade. If a cliff edge Brexit happened, all trade deals and agreements which existed as part of the UK-EU relationship would no longer be applicable, and the UK would begin operating under World Trade Organization rules. Once this happened, the UK would be able to start negotiating deals it doesn't believe would be possible while it's still in the EU. For example, the UK would be able to begin negotiating the much discussed deal between the UK and the US. This would grant the UK a much greater level of control over their trade relationships. The UK would also no longer be subject to the rulings of the European Court of Justice. The court makes rulings in order to create consistency among EU nations. However, after leaving all areas of the EU, the UK would no longer be beholden to the ECJ. But before we get carried away by the pro-Brexit arguments for crashing out of the EU, let's circle back for a moment. We said earlier that after all UK-EU deals and agreements are torn up, the UK would begin operating under World Trade Organization rules. This is a common phrase when discussing Brexit, but what does it actually mean? The World Trade Organization, or WTO, is a global body which governs international trade. There are 164 WTO nations, all of which have different relationships. Some nations have special trade deals which operate only between their countries. But all member nations of the WTO, even ones which don't have trade deals between them, can trade. Those without free trade deals operate under WTO rules instead. If the UK leaves without a trade deal, then all trade between the UK and EU will automatically be subject to WTO rules. The same is true for the UK's trade with other countries. Instead of basing trade on shared EU trade deals, as would have happened before, the UK loses access to the over 50 EU trade deals, and instead all non-EU trade will also be subject to WTO rules. The UK has a lot to lose from crashing out of the EU. Not only does it lose its incredibly close relationship with the EU, which represents 44% of the UK's exports, the UK also loses the 60-something trade deals which it gets through its EU membership. All of these relationships will be replaced by basic WTO rules, at least until the UK has a chance to negotiate deals with individual nations again. Some might argue that this is good for the UK, saying that the EU deals were bad in the first place and that the UK could negotiate better ones for themselves. Regardless of this, it's certainly a big change for the UK and will cause disruption while getting used to. The UK crashing out of the EU and trade being subject to WTO rules isn't guaranteed to happen. Although time is running out, the UK and EU could still reach a deal, or at the very least could agree a transitional period. This would allow the UK to continue operating as normal until a new deal was formed, essentially allowing longer for negotiations. However, if the UK and EU can't agree on either of these things happening, then it will all fall back on WTO rules for the UK. And that's not something the UK government actually wants. The UK government has said that they want to secure a transitional period and develop a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU. That being said, officials in the UK government and EU have implied that no deal being reached is a definite possibility. So enough faffing around talking about possibilities, let's talk about operating under World Trade Organization rules and what that would actually mean for the UK. Strap in because this gets pretty wonky, but you did click on a video called World Trade Organization Rules Explained, so what did you really expect? All WTO nations are expected to submit a document called their schedules. Schedules discuss how a country will trade with all countries they don't have direct trade deals with. Schedules lay out the tariffs that a country places on goods, as well as the quotas and the limits on subsidies. This essentially is a full breakdown of how a nation deals with the rest of the world economically. The schedules say how big a tariff a country will put on imports from each category. Tariffs work like taxes, so if another country is selling cheap goods which undercut the price of local industry, a tariff can be put on the foreign goods which make it comparatively more expensive and encourage your citizens to buy the local goods. The schedules will also state any limits that countries put on imports of certain types of goods. Quotas are import limits and prevent your market from being flooded by foreign goods. On top of this, the schedule will say how much the country is willing to subsidise a type of product. Currently, as an EU nation, the UK operates through the EU schedules. For example, the EU has a trade agreement with Canada, therefore all trade with Canada operates following the terms of this EU trade deal. The EU doesn't have a trade deal with Russia, which means that trade between Russia and UK follows the EU schedules. Hypothetically, let's say that the EU schedules set a tariff of 5% on the import of cars. This means that the UK currently must set a 5% tariff on cars imported from Russia. WTO operates under the rules of most favoured nation market access. This means that nations aren't allowed to discriminate in their tariffs. So, in the example we were just using, if the EU wanted to drop their car tariff to 2%, it would have to do that for all nations they don't hold trade deals with. They can't say that only Russia gets the 2% tariff. Every nation which your country doesn't hold a trade deal with has to get the same tariff. This means that if the UK were to leave the EU without a deal, the EU schedules would automatically be applied to UK exports to the EU. The EU wouldn't be choosing to be spiteful. The EU would be forced to apply the same tariffs set in its schedules if the UK and EU didn't have a free trade deal. Even if the EU wanted to give favourable lower tariffs to the UK, the only way to achieve this would be to decrease the tariffs it charges all other nations, which just isn't feasible. It's for this reason that many people argue that WTO rules aren't the saviour many Brexiteers believe them to be. The WTO solution works best once a deal is reached between the UK and EU. Without a deal, the UK is just subject to the same tariffs as every other nation. This prevents any kind of favourable relationship with the EU until a deal is struck, which could take some time. Time when British exporters may struggle to sell to EU nations due to the tariffs and quotas their goods will be subject to. This is why the government wants to seek a transitional period, which allows them to strike a trade deal with the EU from the comfort of their existing favourable relationship, before they're forced to begin interacting with the EU under World Trade Organization rules. WTO rules also prevent the UK from using tariffs to punish the EU or incentivise them to come to a deal. Some might want the UK to put harsh tariffs on EU goods to bully the EU into a deal that the UK wants. However, to do this, they would need to raise tariffs for every other nation too, which could seriously damage the UK's trade potential. The issues with simply falling back onto WTO rules after Brexit don't stop there. Before trading, the UK needs to come up with its own new schedules, as it would no longer be able to use the EU schedules. The UK government says that it wants to replicate our existing trade regime as far as possible in our new schedules. Essentially, the UK is looking to copy the EU schedules when creating new UK schedules. This is designed to limit disruption. If the UK continues with the EU schedules post-Brexit, there will be less change to deal with, and other WTO nations will be less able to object to the UK's new schedules. That's important because all 164 WTO member nations are able to have their say on the UK's new schedules, so making something that's not controversial is important. The EU's economy is obviously far bigger than the UK's. In fact, by GDP, the EU's economy is around 6.6 times bigger than the UK's, and as such, the UK won't want to set its quotas and subsidies as high as the EU's. What's a low level of imports for the EU would be overwhelming for the UK, so the UK would want to set different, lower quotas. In the same way, the EU's budget is far bigger than the UK government's budget, so the UK won't be able to afford to copy the subsidies from the EU schedules. It will likely want to take a percentage of the EU's quotas and subsidies, but it's not clear what this percentage will be quite yet. Once the UK has left the EU and declared its WTO schedules, it will be able to begin trading using them. Before a schedule can be officially certified, the terms have to be unanimously agreed upon by all 164 nations. However, the UK will be able to start trading under its schedule before it's certified. If a country does object to the UK's schedules, they're able to challenge it. This is a lengthy process and would require the UK to make costly defences of their schedules. These disputes will often continue for several years before resolution, but as the UK is able to trade before certification, this won't impact Brexit in the short term. It is likely that the UK would face a lot of objections to their schedules if they chose to copy the EU's. Being a huge, powerful bloc of nations, the EU has the bargaining capacity to negotiate more favourable terms than other nations do. Therefore, it seems unlikely that the UK will be able to wield as much influence and get the same schedule signed off. This may mean that the UK is only able to place lower tariffs on goods than the EU is able to, giving the UK less control over imports than the EU has. An example of a country likely to object is Russia, who had to limit itself to a maximum tariff of 6.5% on agricultural goods to stop objections to their schedules. This is a lower maximum tariff than the one the EU was able to negotiate, where the average tariff on agricultural goods is 11.5%. This allows the EU much greater control over agricultural imports. Because of this, Russia may be unwilling to let the UK get away with the same high maximum tariffs which the EU was able to negotiate due to the size of the bloc. Negotiations like this are opportunities for other countries to take advantage of vulnerabilities. Other countries aren't looking to give Britain an easy time. Instead, they're looking to get the best out of the negotiations in order to help their industries. As such, if the UK's schedules work against their interests, they will object in an attempt to grow their industries. Brazil, the US and Argentina all objected to the UK's first attempt at a schedule. All of these nations are major food exporters, and the quotas set in the UK's schedules limited the amount of food they could export, most notably affecting their beef, lamb and butter industries. And who can blame them for objecting? This is a great opportunity for these countries and others to increase the amount of sales they can make to the UK. Unlike most other nations, who would wait until objections had died down before joining the WTO, the UK will be thrown into the deep end once they've left the EU. They will have to deal with developing their own schedules and negotiating with objectors at the same time. This makes Britain especially vulnerable and makes the whole situation even more dangerous for the UK. The Centre for Economic Performance projects that if the UK progresses without a deal with the EU and chooses to crash out, operating under WTO rules alone, the UK's trade with the EU would fall by 40% in the subsequent decade. This drop in trade would have a knock-on effect for Brits, with a 2.6% drop in income per person per year. How do you think that Britain will cope with a hard Brexit and WTO rules? Let us know in the comments below.